Alright, today we are going to discuss avian vocal behavior. Um, we're going to look at how sound is produced and controlled in birds. We're going to look at a little bit about the development of vocalizations in young birds. And we'll look at some interesting examples of avian vocalizations and some of the behavior tied to those things. Let's start with just talking about sound in general and what it is. So, sound or sound is a wave, a mechanical wave, and that is created through differences in pressure. And so the book uses the example of hitting a drumhead and what that does to molecules in the air. So when you hit a drumhead, you imagine when you first strike the drumhead, before you strike the drumhead, the air molecules are evenly dispersed around the drumhead. When you hit it, initially the drumhead sinks downward, and that creates space between the drumhead and the air, and it creates a gap. And so there are now less air molecules close to the drumhead relative to further away. As the drumhead vibrates, though, it comes back up again, and now what happens is there's less space, and so it compresses the air molecules that moved into the space created when the drumhead was concave. It compresses those molecules all together into basically a high pressure band. Because this drumhead is vibrating, right? It's going up and down and up and down. It will go down again, and that will leave that gap. Some air molecules will move in to fill the gap, and then it will rise again in the vibration, compressing more molecules together. And so what you get as it's vibrating is, again, gaps that then fill in with air molecules from surrounding the drum that then get compressed, gaps that then get compressed over and over and over again. That's how it creates a physical wave. And when that hits your eardrum, there are differences in the pressure of the portions of the wave that are dense with air molecules and those that are less dense with air molecules. And that's how we hear sound. And as you'll see when we look at how the syrinx functions, there is this labial tissue within the syrinx that vibrates, and it's doing the same sort of thing that a drum head is doing. It's vibrating and creating differences in pressure waves. Of course, when a sound wave hits your ear, it's a mechanical wave that's hitting your ear that causes your eardrum to vibrate, and that transmits a signal to your brain that creates an electrical signal ultimately. And so you have to convert the physical information into electrical information. The pitch of a sound is based on frequency, which is how many cycles occur per second. That is how many of these back and forth, high pressure to low pressure regions of the wave are created every second. That's the frequency. Did I skip one? Oh, okay, I see. So I've tried to embed a lot of videos from Cornell University. All these videos, these are sonograms, which we'll talk about, or spectrograms, which we'll talk about in a second. All these spectrograms are available on Cornell's website, and in the book it tells you to go to this one particular page to see all the spectrograms and listen to the stuff. If you go to that page, it's going to bring you to the sort of generic page for the textbook. You have to scroll down and click on. There's a link that's like something like accessory information sort of link. I can't remember exactly what it says. And then you have to go into chapter 10 within that subsection, and then it brings all those different all those different videos up that have the spectrograms on them. So we can visualize sound using something like a spectrogram or something like an oscillogram. And so let's take a look at what those are. Here we can see we have a change in frequency over time, and that's the spectrogram. And here we have a change in sound intensity, really this volume over time. The pressure of the sound is directly related to the volume. So intensity over time, or even you may think of this as like amplitude and frequency. So here what we're looking at is how loud are the different notes, and this is at what pitch are they being produced, right? Remember, higher frequency sound equals higher pitched sound. So we have here a black-capped chickadee. Their song is "Hey Sweetie." That's the song that they sing. That's not how I remember it in the field. That's not my particular way of thinking about that song, but that is the typical way that ornithologists would describe the song of a black-capped chickadee. Hey, sweetie. And so you see that the spectrogram and oscillogram are two different ways of looking at this song that have a valuable information about that song. These can be combined together if we generate a spectrogram, but we increase the intensity of the brightness of the different notes in terms of the loudness or intensity of those notes. That would represent the information from the oscillogram. And so here we have a color spectrogram where brightness indicates I just realized I'm pointing at the wrong screen. We have two screens going here. So here you see how bright this spectrogram is for hey compared to sweetie, because hey is coming out a little bit louder than sweetie is. That is how we can investigate sound in a visual way. If it's one thing to listen to a sound, but if you look at a spectrogram, particularly a color spectrogram, it tells you a lot about a sound in a way that allows you to use your eyes, when otherwise you couldn't do that. So here we can listen to this sound. Maybe. Hey, sweetie. Listen to the difference in intensity of those notes and the difference in frequency of those notes. Also note right there the pitch change. So the bird dropped the pitch of all of the notes in the song. It went back up again. Went back down again. All right. So that's the idea of a color spectrogram. Okay. I have to control this differently than normal because we have all these videos. All right. So maybe it goes without saying since we just looked at one, but when you visualize these sounds, you can actually see distinct notes that are difficult to hear. Oftentimes the notes blend together, or particularly if a bird sings fairly quickly, it becomes very, very difficult to hear distinct notes. And it's nice because you can literally see them. You can use these spectrograms because they create a signature of different songs to help identify different species. And you can see little differences in the notes that are being sung, even in very familiar species. And that will help you distinguish that species from other species with similar songs. So here, Let's listen to the white-throated sparrow song. Sounds like complete fall, early winter to me. Um, so what information do we have there? Uh, this note that this is very, very bright. So this is the highest intensity note. It starts out with its highest intensity note. That's a lot like the Black-capped chickadee song, actually. Um, you have this stepwise descending pitch, and then you have this dee 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 dee. Peabody is how they try to translate these into a sort of language, an English language way of thinking of them. So they say, "Poor old Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody." But I just say dee 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 dee. It's just easier to remember. Um, but note here these the Peabody notes, which are repeated. This phrasing Peabody, Peabody, Peabody is repeated 3 times. That it is composed of 3 distinct parts. And that is a pattern that you will see over and over and over again if you look at a spectrogram over a long, period of singing. And that pattern will show up in many, many different individuals. It's not like it's just a single bird that has this pattern, a single white-throated sparrow. Um, they all have this same pattern to them. Even if the pitch changes a little bit, even if there's individual variation, which there is individual variation, and the book goes over some information about that, you still get a similar pattern out of those all of the white-throated sparrows. Okay, there we go. All right, this is a common yellowthroat song. You see it looks a lot different in terms of its spectrogram compared to a black-capped chickadee or a white-throated sparrow that we just looked at. They had fairly flat notes that were distinct, and then this has this crazy rising, falling thing going on, right? Note that so you're rising, falling, rising, falling, rising, falling, rising, falling. So this is going to sound very, very different from the last 2 birds we listened to. Additionally, this bird sings very quickly. It's going to whip these notes out in a very short period of time. You can slow this down, and you can hear a little more detail in the song. Let's take a listen to this. I don't know if this is slowed down or not. Find out. No. You can hear other birds in the background. Several. Witchetty, witchetty, witchetty. Witchetty, witchetty, witchetty. So you can hear what you can visualize, right? You can see it on the screen, and you can hear it going up and down and up and down. It's a very whippy sounding song. So that's a common yellowthroat. Now let's look at a much more complicated song. So the common yellowthroat, it looks much more complex than, say, the white-throated sparrow song does. But if you look at something like a Pacific wren, it gets way more complex. The Pacific wren has a very highly complex song with lots of intricacy to it. And it's a very long song. It's like 10 or 15 seconds or something like that. So, well, actually, On this recording, it's about 11 seconds. So it's a very long song, and it is fast, wicked fast song, and it, even though it takes a long time to sing it, it crams a lot of notes into the amount of time it takes to sing that song, and it sounds like kind of chaotic. We can use a spectrogram and technology to slow the sound down, and that really helps pull the intricacies out. So let's listen to two different recordings here. We have the song at normal speed and then the song at quarter speed. Note when you cut speed down, when you slow down um, the spectrogram, it also cuts frequency. So you're gonna notice that the pitch drops significantly. So this is normal sound speed. There were so many notes in that 11 or so second stretch, right? It was just like rapid fire machine gun of auditory information, which if you're this a Pacific Rim, your brain is designed to process that. That's what you recognize as your own. But for us, there was a lot that just happened there, and it was just intense, really hard to process. Let's listen to the same exact recording slowed down to quarter speed. Okay. Um, um, so you can hear so much more slowing it down, right? You can hear all the phrasing that's going on in that rapid fire call. It's pretty interesting if you're familiar with some other common species of birds like cardinal. You might have heard within that phrasing some things that really sound like some things a cardinal would some sounds a cardinal might make. Um, and that's it's pretty cool. Great way to learn these songs is to listen to them and slow them down, listen to them again, and you can pick up all the little intricacies. All right, so not all sounds are vocal. Some sounds are created by striking an object or doing something similar to that. And so, of course, woodpeckers are an example of birds that make vocal sounds, but also do drumming. And drumming is a form of communication in woodpeckers that is that comes from them rapidly using their beaks to tap on a tree. Or sometimes it's not a tree. I have seen, for example, I watched a northern flicker land on a metal guardrail on the side of the road and drum the guardrail, and it was unbelievably loud because it's hitting basically a thin sheet of metal with its face. Um, it was a very interesting thing to see. But so it doesn't have to be wood, but that's typically they're drumming a tree. These types of sounds are what we call noisy sounds because what you have here, the tree doesn't just vibrate at sort of one frequency, it vibrates at many, many frequencies all at once. And so every time a single drum is performed, that's a single time a tap is performed on a tree, it creates this stack of frequencies that are produced all at once. and so you don't get pure notes. You get these tall, messy looking notes being produced. Uh, these drumming patterns in woodpeckers can be used to identify the species. It is not easy. I will tell you, as someone who spends a lot of time in the field, some of them are pretty challenging to, like, man, I'm leaning more downy woodpecker on that or whatever. But there are some people that are really good at it, but it is challenging to do. But you can distinguish them. And if you have a spectrogram, it's a lot easier to distinguish them. So let's listen and compare two very similar looking species, the downy woodpecker and the hairy woodpecker here. And let's compare that to the hairy woodpecker. So you might have noticed that there is the notes on the hairy woodpecker are much more rapid fire, right? They're very tightly laid down, so that thing is hitting, it's drumming really, really quickly compared to the downy woodpecker. The hairy woodpecker is much faster. So one more time, let's listen to the other order. So listen to how fast this is. And compare that to this. It's way slower. The number of notes over a period of time is much higher in the hairy woodpecker. And then you can listen to a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And on the yellow-bellied sapsucker, what you're going to see is there's a variable rate, a slowing down in the spectrogram. So you hear that the first few notes are really quick, and then it slows down significantly. So all the woodpeckers, that we might encounter around here can be separated out by the drumming pattern. And this is a totally non-vocal form of communication. Again, woodpeckers do make vocalizations, but these are ways that they can communicate with each other that are non-vocal. I gotta get through all. Well, shoot. Okay. Let's look at a couple other really cool forms of non-vocal communication. So here we have a palm cockatoo, and they drum as well. First, we have to watch this advertisement. I'm sponsored by this tent company. Not really. Okay. Skip ad, please. Wait, can I do it over here? There we go.
They're my favorite bird. Full stop. I'm absolutely enthralled by them. They are an amazing creature. Nothing like it in the animal world. And I have to admit, I'm not meant to admit this as a zoologist, but they're very human-like. And I find that makes them all the more fascinating to me. He will craft his own drumstick. He'll snip off the branch and he'll whittle it down, strip off all the bark, and then he'll grasp it in his foot and he'll bang on the side of the tree hollow. And he does it in a way that's really quite rhythmic. It's very unusual in the bird world or in the animal world, because most of the time when animals make tools, it's for the purposes of foraging, finding things to eat. This is the only case that we know of where a tool is made for the purposes of a sexual display.
Oh, okay. Um, you can find that video on YouTube, of course. You just type in palm cockatoo drumming. There's a bunch of cool videos of it. Yeah, so they take drumming in a very different extent by like they quite literally create a drumstick and drum with it, which is really neat. But it's a form of communication that is non-vocal. Uh, Many different birds communicate information through sounds that are made as wind travels over their feathers during flight. So, an American woodcock is an example of that. We're not going to watch a whole lot of this video, but you should hear like some like high frequency ish sound um, coming off that that sort of twittering sound you hear. So that's just caused by wind traveling through the flight feathers. It creates that sound. That's not a vocalization of the bird. Um, and it is a form of communication. All right, so let's talk about songs, and then we're going to talk about calls and kind of compare them. So, first, what are songs? Songs are typically long vocalizations that are relatively loud, and their functions are for mate attraction and territorial advertisement. To say, like, hey, this is my territory, and to say to the other opposite sex, like, hey, let's make a baby. So, that is the function of songs. Um, their complexity, though, varies greatly. Some songs are really, really complex, like we saw with the Pacific Wren, and some are quite simple, like we saw with the black-capped chickadee. What's interesting in the black-capped chickadee is their song is simpler even than their calls. And this is not, I would say, the typical situation. The typical situation is that calls tend to be very simple vocalizations and songs tend to be more complex than calls. So if we just real quick, this is Hey Sweetie again. This is the song. Okay. This is the chickadee call. They have these species has a couple different calls, but this is one of their communication calls. This is a flock identity call, basically. Say like, hey, I'm a member of the flock here. Um, they have another call. It's called a gargle call. That's like a dominance call as well. But you can see that in the black-capped chickadee, the song is really, really simple compared even to this call. Again, this is not the typical circumstance. All right. Something that is probably very confusing because it's not particularly where we live, it's not really the case, but for many species of birds, particularly tropical birds, females sing just as much or even more than males do. Um, so, song is not a male exclusive thing. An example of this would be the streak-backed oriole you see on the left here. That the bird on the right is not like a different oriole. Okay, but the streak-backed oriole, we'll get to the other bird in a second. In the streak-backed oriole, the female sings even more than the male does. Now, why does the female sing? Well, they sing for a couple reasons, and your book goes over this. First, they sing for the same sorts of reasons in general that the males sing. So one of the things they're doing is broadcasting territorial claims. Hey, this is my territory. Stay out of here. Um, they also advertise when they are in their fertile period, when they're receptive to reproduction, to say, hey, now is the time. If you want to make a baby, this is the time to do it. And this is the case with species like the one on the right, which is a black-headed grosbeak. They will do this, and they will even go a step further, and they use their song, the females use their song, to communicate with their babies, which is pretty neat. So what's really exceptional about this is that the babies, when they are fledging, so when the young are moving off the nest and learning how to be independent birds, there's a period in fledging where the young, they're not ready to be fully independent birds yet. There's a few weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. It's not usually that long. And in that window of time, one of the ways that they stay in communication with their mother is by hearing her sing. And even though all the individual black-headed grosbeaks in the area will be singing the same song, they are able to distinguish their parent singing against other black-headed grosbeaks singing. So they can hear and distinguish the subtle individual variation in their own familial song. It's pretty cool. Some species take singing to the next level in various ways. Um, and particularly, this is in what we call the oscines, or the songbirds. In something like a black-capped chickadee, we have a simple song, okay? But so that's like at one extreme end, I would say. It's a very, very simple song, just a couple notes. In um, in some birds, though, like the mimids, particularly the brown thrasher, which is the example from your book, they take it to the far other extreme end, where they can learn a tremendous number of variants on vocalizations and completely new vocalizations and add them to their overall pool of sounds. And and so in the mimids, having these diverse, well, I shouldn't say in mimids in general because it's a little bit of a too broad of a statement. Let's just say in the um, brown thrashers. In brown thrashers, having a diverse pool of song is indicative in some ways of the quality of genetics, right? If you're able to learn lots and lots and lots of different songs, you must be a pretty smart individual, and that's an attractive quality. And so you'll find that brown thrashers make a lot of different sounds when they sing. And um, the maximum number, no one knows exactly what it is, but we know that it's over 2,000 different memorized songs or song phrases. And here you can see an example. Um, this is a phrase, and this is a phrase. These are two different songs that this bird has learned. And so let's take a listen to a brown thrasher. Note that a lot of those different phrasings came out in like couplets, like two at a time. That's actually a useful indicator of brown thrasher. I mean, you learn their voice eventually if you're out in the field, but that most of them come out in twos is useful for identification purposes in at least in our area, where well, we're in my area. I know some of you are West Coast, so so that's the brown thrasher. So you can see how much more complex that kind of song is compared to the song of something like a black-capped chickadee. So this really is illustrating the breadth of complexity across songbirds, from very, very simple to rich, complex, and highly varied songs. So now let's listen to talk about some calls. So calls are, well, they're the opposite of songs. If songs tend to be longer, more complex things, calls tend to be shorter, simpler vocalizations. And in general, they are used to communicate information other than mate attraction information. Here we can see on the left the spectrograms for cedar waxwings calls. Cedar waxwings are interesting. They don't have what we might traditionally call a song. They just have a couple different calls. They have a what's called a Z call and a C call. The difference is the Z is a much more buzzy sounding call, and the C call is a much more pure note call. On the right there, we can see a red-winged blackbird. That's a female red-winged blackbird call. They have this jeer call that is a warning from female to stay out of their territory. So stay away from me. So it's a call, but it's territorial, which is a lot like what we might think of as a song in some tropical birds. But this is very simple. In this case, these are basically single note sounds. So we'll listen to these cedar waxwing and red-winged blackbird calls real quick. So here's cedar waxwing's C call. It's just one high-pitched note held for a fraction of a second. There's a lot. Listen to this one first, and then we'll talk about that. That buzz, that high-pitched buzz. Okay. So you've got the buzz, the buzzy, and then you've got the C. They have a ton of small variation within these calls that they use to communicate all the different things they need to communicate within a flock or within a pair of waxwings. So they make little modifications that are very subtle to communicate different types of information. Let's listen to the red-winged blackbird's cheer call real quick. So that is a female red-winged blackbird saying, "Stay away, stay away." That is what that is used for. It's very, very simple, slightly down slurred note. All right. So a little bit about the structure of vocalization. There are a number of qualities of vocalization that are important to think about when you're thinking about song. And some of these things we've already hit on in various ways. So things like how long the song is, the duration of the song, and even the duration of maybe phrases within the song. The frequency of the notes, or the average frequency of the song. How pure the notes are. Are they Are they like a woodpecker drum with a bunch of frequencies stacked on top of each other, or are they very, very pure notes like the C call of a cedar waxwing? Uh, how many repetitions there are? Um, does each note get repeated a certain number of times, and the patterns that are created through those repetitions? And then something called the timbre of uh, the song itself. And this sort of is, we can sort of think of as the individual voices of the species. Um, a way to think about this is if we think about instruments and you think about, say, a an acoustic guitar and a fiddle. They're both string instruments, but they sound completely different. And then if someone else picks up a viola and plays that, it sounds completely different, even if all three instruments play the same note. And then what if you grab, I don't know, a French horn? It can also play the same note and it will sound totally different, right? So every instrument has a quality called the timbre, and that is the sort of descriptive quality of what that instrument itself sounds like. The same thing is true for all other sounds. It's what gives us, for example, it's one of the things that gives us our unique voices. Our voices dictated in part by the structures of our voice box and our skulls and uh, other things as well. But that's a part of it. It's sort of, we are, our physical structure affects the sounds we make, and it's the same thing in birds. The sound structure, the structure, all these different qualities, duration, frequency, etc., are related to the function of the call and the habitat the call is being produced in. Okay. So, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Come back. Come back to me. I have messed up my. I don't know how I did this. Okay, recording's still going, so that's good. 1 second. There we go. Resume slideshow, please. I'm not really sure what just happened. There we go. Sorry about that. I know you can't see what's going on, but on my computer, my PowerPoint just like exploded. All right, it's back. It's weird because on the screen where it was a record on one screen and uh, I this is like a side screen, but then I have the the main screen with my camera and everything built into it. That screen was a mess. All right, so again, we're talking about vocalization structure, and you've got things like duration, frequency, etc., like we talked about. But that sound structure is related again to the function of the sound and the habitat that the sound is being produced in. These are both, uh, they have some really practical implications for the structure. So if you think of uh, giving a predator warning call, right? Let's say you're in a flock and you see a predator. It's flying overhead. What you don't want to necessarily do is give up your position to the predator, but you also are compelled to let the members of your flock know, hey, there's a predator here. And so you you tend to get pretty high pitched sounds that aren't super loud. And often they start slow, they get louder, and then they taper back off again. Or start quiet, get louder, and taper back off again. Um, and the pitch that they're given at, these calls are given at, tend to be high enough that they they make it difficult for a predator to use those particular sounds to locate an individual bird. right? You wouldn't want to make sounds that made it easy for you to find. On the flip side, uh, there's something called a mob call. And the mob call is pretty cool because what it is a sound to sort of go to battle. And you'll get, usually we're talking about something like a raptor, so a bird of prey. And then you'll get all of these small flocking passerine birds that mob the crap out of the raptor, and they basically bully it so that it leaves the area. And it's very effective because once that mob call starts going, more and more and more birds will come into the area. They get really riled up. Birds respond pretty aggressively to this type of call, and they will literally like swoop and swat at the predator. The predator knows that it's typically, once this happens, it's time to move on. It's not going to be successful in any hunt in that area. Every bird in the area knows it's there. Um, and so they are able to bully the predator away. That's the mob call. Um, this the mob call is used sometimes in ornithological field research because if you need to get to really get a picture of what birds are in an area, at least what passerine birds are in an area, you can play the mob call over a loudspeaker, and all the birds in the area will come in and they will be looking for the predator. They'll come in, they'll perch up, and they'll be making a big ruckus in the forest to try, or wherever, whatever habitat you're in, trying to find that predator. And so you can count birds and say, okay, there's this many of this species and that species, and things like that. It's a really it's a really cool experience to see it because it is an aggressive response. You see a ton of birds very quickly, and it really tells you something about the strength of the signal of the mob call to those species. So, how does habitat play into this? Well, if you think about, and it's easiest to do when you think about I think a forest. If you think about a dense forest and you think about sound traveling through a dense forest, the forest will muffle that sound. Sounds as they're reflecting off of different surfaces in the forest, the more dense it is, the less distance it will travel, and the as that distance progresses, the lower the quality of the sound. The lower the quality of the sound will be. And so you can have a species that's in a dense forest, and that same species maybe lives in a less dense forest, and the species in the dense forest will sing a variation on their particular song that is more well suited to the dense forest so that they can project their song a further distance in that dense forest. It's all about the habitat. If you took that same species and let's say it could exist in both a dense forest and a grassland, it would probably be even more extremely different because in a grassland it's extremely open, and so the overall structure of the song could be very different. All right, so some development stuff. Birds are not just born typically having a perfect recording of the song in their mind. What they do have is a sort of template, and I can explain how we know that. Um, First, we have to understand a little bit about how learning happens in young birds. So, when birds are young, and in the case of the white-throated sparrow, which is what most of this has been studied in, we're talking about between about the ages of 15 days old to 50 days old. So when they're quite young, their minds are very, very good at listening to songs and recording that information and then they practice replicating those sounds that they have just recorded. And they do this by producing a subsong. And a subsong is not something that you can really hear out in the wild. A subsong is they sort of sit perched on a branch and quietly practice the song, sort of like they're practicing the song to themselves, and then they practice it, and then they listen, and then they practice it, and then they listen, and they're kind of comparing what they're producing to the recording in their mind of what the song should sound like, until they learn, they lay down the neurological pathways to produce the same song that they're hearing in their mental recording. And they learn from the other individuals of the same species around them, which is very important to understand. Because one of the experiments that has been done with white crowned sparrows, is to take a young individual during the sensitive period, remove it from any other white crowned sparrows, and hold it in isolation. So you've got this young white crowned sparrow, it's in its sensitive period, and then see after the sensitive period what song it produces. It has not learned a song from any individuals. It's been isolated the whole time. And what happens is they have this, it's called an isolate song. And that's just a song that is sort of like the basic template of a song that is ingrained in the species at a, must be at a genetic level. It's passed on. It's some genetic level. It's sort of like the baseline for the song. But any of the intricacies of the song are gone. They don't have them. And so this isolate song sounds totally different from an actual white crowned sparrow song. Another really interesting thing they did is, so we know in nature that when birds are together out in nature, and they're learning songs in their sensitive period, they can hear all sorts of species singing, right? They're just outside in nature. So they can hear all sorts of species singing, but they still only learn the songs of their species. So they are in some ways able to tell that's the right song. That song I'm hearing, that's the one I need to be practicing, not this other guy over here, this other species over here. So, a question was, is there any way to get one bird to learn in a completely different species song? And so what they did is they isolated some individual young white-crowned sparrows during the sensitive period again, and then they put them with song sparrows, male song sparrows that were singing. And in that case, during the sensitive period, if there are no individuals of the same species to learn from, they found that these young white-crowned sparrows at least were able to learn the song of a completely different species. So they seem to be very hardwired to listen and learn. And when there is when there are no individuals singing of the same species, they listen and learn to whatever they can, and if it's a different species, they can actually learn that song. So they produced white-crowned sparrows that sang song sparrow songs, which is fascinating. It tells us, I think, quite a bit about the nature of learning. That sub song is even very interesting. All of this is very similar to young human learning, when humans are first learning, for example, to talk. And babies, they start to learn to talk by babbling. You'll hear a baby just making what seems like cute, nonsensical sounds. That's learning to make sounds that mimic the individuals that are speaking around you. That's what that is. That's how they learn. So basically, a baby bird and a baby human learn to produce sounds in a very similar way. Let's take a listen here. This recording's cool because it's going to play the white-crowned sparrow song. It's like the real song. And then it's going to repeat that several times. And then you're going to hear the isolate song. So that's the song that the white-crowned sparrows produce when they've been isolated and haven't had anyone to learn from. In case it's not clear, this is the isolate song. Do you hear how different these two sounds are? I'm not sure how to. I can do it over here. Okay, isolate. Just really simple notes, right? So that's the isolate song versus the actual song. So the isolate song, I think, has important implications for understanding. So what a mind is capable of having in it as a sort of baseline to build off of. There is some song sitting there in the mind of the bird as baseline, and then they modify and build off that base to when as they're learning from individuals around them to create the full and true song of the white-crowned sparrow. Really, really cool stuff. There we go. All right. So how actually does a bird produce this sound? So we talked about earlier how like a drum head vibrating produces a mechanical sound wave. In a bird, this is done in the syrinx. And here in this diagram, what you can see is the syrinx. It is surrounded by muscles that control the syrinx. If we were to cut those muscles away, we would see that the syrinx is held open by a series of cartilaginous rings. And inside the two tubes of the syrinx is this labial tissue that vibrates like a drum head and produces that sound wave. The muscles surrounding the syrinx can control the labia in each one of the two uh, bronchial portions of the syrinx, the two tubes, uh, independently. That has interesting implications for the ability to make sounds. We can't do anything even vaguely similar to this with our own voices. So, what this essentially, if we were thinking about this maybe in humanish terms, it's kind of like having two completely separate voice boxes. They can produce one note in one tube, on in one half of this total structure, and then a completely different note in the other tube. This permits birds to harmonize with themselves. Um, that's incredible. That's a really, really cool thing. And they use those muscles surrounding the syrinx, the syringeal muscles, to do that. Those syringeal muscles control things like the frequency, speed, and amplitude of the song. This is a wood thrush. You're going to hear, if you listen closely, this wood thrush sings two notes right at the same time. Hopefully you can hear the two notes. That sort of like what's called majestic quality of their sound is the harmonizing of the two parts of the syrinx working together, making two notes that overlap in a beautiful way. It's one of my favorite sounds of the summer forests in our area. All right. So now we get into what I'm going to say is the most complicated part of the chapter, and that is the two neurological pathways that control ultimately those syringeal muscles. So we'll start with the motor pathway because the motor pathway is straightforward. So the motor pathway starts. There's a region in the avian brain called the HVC. That's literally what it's called. I know HVC seems like it should be an acronym, and it used to be an acronym, but due to some uh, greater neurobiological understanding of avian brain anatomy, HVC no longer. It's literally just it's called the HVC. So the HVC is sort of the central coordinating, sound coordinating part of the brain. The HVC communicates with something called the RA. This is the robust nucleus of the archopallium. In the book, it says it's the archistriatum. That's not wrong. It's like some old terminology. That's okay. What the RA does, though, is it acts as a hub between all of these higher order brain processes that are dealing with sound, and it sort of integrates them and then communicates them down here to this thing called NXLLTS. This is much more simply thought of, particularly in terms of this whole model here. It's just the cranial nerve, it's the 12th cranial nerve, that communicates with the syringeal muscles. So this HVC communicates at a higher, it's a higher level vocal processing center that communicates with this bridge, the RA, that sends a signal to the 12th cranial nerve that sends a signal to the syringeal muscle. This is the motor pathway. It's really very straightforward. I'm going to make this. Hold on. I need to use my mouse over here. I'm going to make a sound now. I'm going to sing. The RA says, okay, you're going to sing. I'm going to coordinate that information about the sound we're going to make, and I'm going to send it to the 12th cranial nerve. The cranial nerve is like, okay, message received. I'm sending it to the syringeal muscles. And then the syringeal muscles do their thing. They affect the labia in the syrinx, and air is pushed through the syrinx, and a sound is produced. And that it's all being controlled through this motor pathway. The anterior forebrain pathway is much more complicated. So again, it starts with the HVC, and you see there's this arrow that goes to something called area X. Area X is a vocal learning center. So this particular anterior pathway is important in both, I should say, young and adult birds, but it's really, really important in young birds when they're still learning how to make any sound at all, right? They haven't really figured out how to make vocalizations, like when they're practicing their sub-song, for example. So this vocal learning area is the first part of this pathway, where they're literally like distinguishing, like, hey, is the sounds that I'm making similar to the sounds that the other birds are making? Are these different ways I'm controlling my syringeal muscles? Are they producing sounds that I want to be producing? That sort of thing. So that's area X. Area X coordinates with something called the dorsolateral medial nucleus, DLM. The DLM is what takes the information, the learning information from area X, and integrates it and then sends it to something called L-man. L-man is the lateral magnocellular nucleus of the nidopallium, of the nidopallium. I think your book calls, I think it calls it the neostriatum or something like that. This is older terminology. But we'll just call it L-man. L-man's good. L-man is responsible for controlling song plasticity and exploring vocal options and oh, I could modify my sounds a little bit by doing this with my syrinx, for example. And so that particular region of the brain is capable of communicating back with area X. And it says like, "Hey, learning center, uh, we can do we can if we modify the sound in this way, this is what happens." Like, and we can it explores the possibilities of adjusting sounds. And so look at what happens here. This is pretty interesting. Area X communicates to DLM, the coordinates information, and passes it to L-man. And then L-man can pass that information back to area X. And so what you have here is this little closed loop system of learning. We take information, we process it, we send it here, we process it here, and then we send it back. And you have this closed learning loop for sound. L-man, once this loop is finished, will send whatever instructions have been decided upon to the RA, which we already know what the RA is and what it does. It takes information and acts like a bridge between these higher learning processes or these higher order mental processes and the 12th cranial nerve. And so it takes this information from L-man, sends it to the 12th cranial nerve, and the 12th cranial nerve does the same thing. It sends that information to the muscles of the syrinx, the syringeal muscles, and then a sound ultimately gets produced based on that information. So this learning loop is much more complicated. Obviously, it's extremely important in young birds when they're trying to replicate a sound, right? The sounds get stored and replicated, and as the bird is trying to replicate that sound, it has to keep using this learning loop process in the brain to, I'm going to make a sound, I'm going to see if it matched the sound that I had recorded. Oh no, it didn't. I'm going to modify the sound. I'm going to try again, and it just keeps doing that. Now, why is this important in an older bird, in an adult bird? Well, you are probably familiar with the adage, if you don't use it, you lose it. And when we talk about learning things, and that is just to say that if you think of all the vast things you've learned in your life, if you think of things that you learned even just in this class this semester, you have already forgot some of them, because the way our brains work is if we do not continuously use pieces of information, that information tends to be lost. As an interesting just little aside, it also turns out that information becomes much more easy to pick back up if you were to need to go back to it and relearn it. So there is at least that. But yeah, if you don't use information, you do slowly lose bits of it, especially highly intricate information. For example, I would say when you leave this class, you will have a fairly good, hopefully, I really hope so, broad understanding about songs and calls from this lecture, right? You're not going to remember for past the exam, you're not going to remember the HVC communicates with area X, which communicates with DLM, that communicates with L-man, that passes that information to RA, that passes it to the 12th cranial nerve, that passes it to the syringeal muscles. You will not remember that pathway. It is a highly detailed thing, and unless you're an avian neurobiologist, memorizing this is unnecessary, right? But you might remember that the avian brain has a has two pathways that it uses to control song, and one of them is associated with learning, and the other is just a direct control of vocal motor function. So you might remember that. It's the same thing in birds. This idea that if you don't use it, you lose it. So in an adult bird, all of that I just said was just to get to this. In an adult bird, if they don't continuously evaluate the quality of their song through the anterior forebrain pathway, the quality of the song can degrade over time. And so one of the big hypotheses about this function in the adult birds is keeping the song of a high quality. At the same time, there are some species of birds. I should say this, and I think I meant to say this earlier, and I don't think I did. But so there are, while most birds within the sensitive, that sensitive window where they're really listening and learning, right? Let me just go back to the slide real quick because I make sure, yeah. So most birds, right, in this sensitive period when they're doing their learning and they're practicing their subsong, they stop learning after the sensitive period. Um, they they become that's not entirely a fair statement. It becomes much more difficult for them to learn songs after the sensitive period. Much more difficult. And actually, there have been experiments done with that, um, where they isolated birds until the sensitive period was over, and then put them. They did this with white-crowned sparrows again, and they put them with adults that could sing after that sensitive period, and the birds were able to learn, but it was much more difficult for them to learn. There are some birds called open-ended learners, things like brown thrashers, that keep learning new vocalizations um, through time. Okay, they keep learning new sounds. Those birds, this process maintains an extreme importance for those birds. Okay, so an interesting thing about these regions, the HVC and the L-man and all that stuff, is that in birds with larger, more complex songs, these regions of the brain are actually larger and more complex. So there's a direct relationship between sort of the size of the song and the size of these various regions. Um, and if you look at within a species individuals that, so like let's say a brown thrasher, and you have one individual that's learned, let's say 1,000 different vocalizations, another that's learned 40. The one that's learned 1,000 different pieces of song will have larger regions for these different brain regions than the one that only knows 40. So again, a direct relationship between the size of these brain regions and the overall size of the song. This is true within species. It's also true with between sexes. So like if males are singing more large, complex songs than females, which is often the case, these regions of the brain will be larger because they're doing this job. What's really cool and has implications and had and does have implications for human biology and vertebrate biology in general is that these regions of the brain actually shrink over time within a given seasonal cycle. So in the breeding window, when let's say, let's just use a male singing to females as an example. When a male is singing a lot and is trying to attract a mate, these regions will grow. New neurons will be created in these different regions. And and so the size increases. After the breeding season, they actually degrade and they shrink. And until the beginning of the next breeding season, that will be the case. And then they'll relay down new neurons and do it all over again. That's pretty amazing. And it's especially pretty amazing because there was a time in our history where neurobiologists did not believe that once the brain was fully developed, it could create new neurons. This was a big piece of evidence that that was not the case. And in fact, the brain can indeed continue to create new neurons. Um, but this was one of the clues that told neurobiologists this was the case by studying these regions of the brain. Another important factor. So this entire model of the uh, song control pathways doesn't apply to the subossine birds. They have evolved different neurological pathways that do the same sort of stuff. Maybe they're less complex in some cases. They're but they have different pathways to control their vocalizations. Parrots and hummingbirds, which can have, parrots, my gosh, they have incredibly intricate abilities to learn sounds and produce sounds. Um, but parrots and hummingbirds, as examples, have evolved similar pathways, but completely independently from the ossine birds. Okay, so I knew this lecture was going to go a bit long. It's an hour and 16 minutes already, and there's still quite a bit more in this chapter to talk about. So the rest of the chapter really goes into a couple different things. One of them is on individual variation in sound. That is to say, like bird A and bird B will have their own distinct little differences in the sounds they produce. So it talks about that. It talks about regional dialects, which is extremely interesting and what your discussion question is going to be about. And then the chapter also goes into just some other generally interesting things and revolving around avian sound production. It talks about things like the dawn chorus, mimicry, duetting. There's a bunch of other things like that in there. Obviously, you need to read the whole chapter, so you'll get to see that stuff as well. And it's a relatively small part of the chapter. But for the discussion question this week, it's not that different from any other discussion question. It might be a little more challenging. I'm not sure. So what you need to do is find a journal article on a single species that discusses the regional dialects of that species. And the discussion post is a summary of the major findings of the paper and any implications that there are in that paper for the ecology of the species and the evolution of the species. I know for a fact that these papers are out there. You can find them. It just takes a little bit of work. You go to Google Scholar, type in species dialect. Right? So I think I went last night just to make sure that for this discussion question, it wasn't going to be incredibly difficult to do. And so I hopped on Google Scholar and it just was like Northern Cardinal regional dialect, or maybe even just dialect. Black-capped chickadee regional dialect. I just picked some common birds. Their papers are out there to be found. So you're going to find a paper that's on a specific species regional dialects. You're going to summarize the major findings of that paper, including the implications for the ecology and evolution of that species, and post that. It does not have to be a giant book of information. It should just do exactly what I just said. You can do that in probably like 2 reasonable paragraphs. And then your response is going to be comparing the implications section of what you wrote to what other papers say about the implications of these things for other species that other students are writing about. That is the discussion question. All right, that was a long one, an hour and 20. I'm going to stop there. If anyone has any questions, please reach out to me.